Marian Fenwick had her hand on the 3rd page of a letter she was not required to understand when the Duke of Rothermere said, on the other side of the study door, that he needed a wife by Sunday. She did not move. She had learned in 7 years of being paid to be invisible that stillness was the only currency that never devalued. And so she stood in the corridor with the ink still wet under her thumb and listened, and told herself she was only waiting for the room to empty. She did not yet know what that sentence would cost her, or what it would buy her, though she would remember, afterward, that she had heard it standing exactly where the light from the tall window struck the flagstones gold, as if the house itself wanted her to notice. Had she known everything the words would ask of her, she would have listened just the same. Julian Vale's voice came next, soft as a hand laid flat on a table. "Cousin, you cannot purchase a bride the way you purchase seed corn, not even you, and certainly not by Sunday." There was a pause in which she heard nothing but the fire settling, and then the Duke answered, and his voice did not rise, though something in it had the weight of a door being shut very carefully so as not to wake a sleeping-house. "I am aware of the calendar, Julian. I had it explained to me at length by your own hand, in a letter I did not ask you to write." Marian had copied 11 letters that week in the Duke of Rothermere's employ, none of them addressed to her, all of them teaching her the shape of his sentences the way another woman might learn a suitor's face. She knew, from the household accounts she was not asked to keep, but could not help reading with a clerk's eye, that Rothermere's fortune had been bleeding for 3 years from wounds no one could name, and that the old Duke's will, read to her only in fragments by Mrs. Hobb, who liked an audience for grievance, required his son to be a married man before he turned 30, on pain of losing every unentailed acre and shilling to whichever cousin the will named next, which was, God help the house, Julian Vale. The 30th birthday fell that Sunday. 5 days. She had done the sum without meaning to. Sums arrived in her the way weather arrived in other people, unbidden and always accurate. She was still doing it when the study door opened, and the Duke of Rothermere found her standing in the corridor with a letter she had no business holding, and did not apologise for either of them. "Miss Fenwick," he said, and it was not a question, though his eyes went first to the paper in her hand, and only after to her face, which she counted, later as the first true thing she learned of him. "I was copying the tenant rents," she said. "I did not intend to hear anything past the 2nd sentence." "You heard past the 2nd sentence regardless," he said. "Most people would deny it. I find denial takes longer than the truth and costs more," she said, "and buys nothing at the end of it." Something crossed his face that was not quite a smile, though it used the same muscles. Julian Vale appeared behind him in the doorway, smoothing his cuff with 2 fingers, a gesture so unhurried it might have been mistaken for kindness by anyone who had not just heard him speak of purchasing a bride like seed corn. "Miss Fenwick copies a very fair hand. It is a pity fair hands are so seldom attached to fortunes." "I have never found fortune improved a hand," Marian said. "Only the paper it was written on." Julian laughed, a short, pleasant sound, and went away down the passage smelling faintly of bergamot, and the Duke watched him go with an expression she would spend the next 4 days learning to read, and could not yet. He asked her to walk with him to the terrace, which was not a request companions or copyists were generally given, and she went because refusing seemed a longer road to the same place. "Sunday," he said, without preamble, watching the lawns as though they owed him money. "My father's will. I imagine you heard the whole of it. I heard that you require a wife by Sunday. or lose the greater part of what is not entailed to your cousin," she said. "I did not hear why your father thought that a wise clause to write into a will." "Neither did I, until 3 years ago," he said, and did not go on, and she understood that this was a door he had shut on purpose, the way she had learned to shut her own. He turned to her instead with the particular directness of a man used to being obeyed and unused to being liked for it. "I am going to ask you an improper question, Miss Fenwick, and you are free to walk away from it without a mark against your character." "Ask it," she said. "Would you marry me, for the estate's sake and not for mine, on terms you set yourself, and be gone from this arrangement the moment it has served its purpose, with your fortune and your name entirely your own?" She had imagined in 7 years of small humiliations every proposal that might ever be offered her, and none of them had sounded like a contract read aloud, which was, she would later think, the only kind she could have trusted. "What would you want of me in exchange?" she asked, and he said, "Only your name beside mine before Sunday's clerk, and your silence about the reasons." And she said, "And what would I have of you?" And for the first time since the study door he looked faintly amused, and said, "Terms, Miss Fenwick. Write them." "I generally do," she said, and did not smile, though she wanted to. And somewhere above them a thrush began to sing, ordinary and unbothered, as though nothing in the world had just been decided under it. She wrote the terms that night at her aunt's kitchen table, by one candle, in the fair copyist's hand that had, until that afternoon, only ever served other people's business. Mrs. Ottilie Prynne watched her from the good chair with the particular anxiety of a woman 3/4 through her savings and pretending otherwise. "You cannot marry a duke on a Tuesday and be sensible about it by Wednesday," her aunt said. "I intend to be sensible about it before I sign anything," Marian said, "which is the only order that has ever worked." She wrote that she would keep her own income and her own name in law, though not in style, that she would have her own rooms and her own key, that no one would call the marriage a love match to her face or behind her back without correction, that her aunt's small debts would be settled quietly and without her aunt's humiliation, and that she, Marian, would have the run of the estate ledgers for as long as she remained his wife, to occupy herself as she saw fit. She underlined that last clause twice. It was not vanity. It was the only inheritance her father had left her that anyone could not take away, an eye that read a column of figures the way other women read a face, and she had learned young that an eye like that kept busy, kept her steady, and an eye like that, unused, went looking for trouble in rooms where there was none to find yet. She did not write that her father, Thomas Fenwick, had died in a debtor's cell 11 years before over a promissory note he swore he had never signed, and that she had kept the torn corner of that note in a tin box since she was 14. Because there are debts a contract cannot settle, and grief is one of them. She fair copied the terms twice, once for herself, and set out on foot in the grey of the following morning to Rothmere Hall, where she found the Duke already at his desk, as though he had not slept, and perhaps had not. He read her 4 pages without lifting his eyes until the last line, and she watched his hands instead of his face, because a man's hands, she had found, told the truth his face had been trained out of telling. His hands did not hesitate. He signed at the bottom in a hand as plain as her own, no flourish, the ink still shining when he turned the page toward her to show her he had struck nothing out. "You have not asked me for money beyond your aunt's debts," he said. "I did not think it decent," she said, to price myself higher than the trouble I was hired to solve. He looked at her a long moment, and there was something in it she would only understand much later, once she had learned the shape of his silences the way she had learned the shape of his sentences, that he was a man who had spent 3 years watching everyone around him calculate his worth in acres and income, and had forgotten, until that morning, that a person could sit across a desk from him and want none of it. Then Sunday, he said. Then Sunday, she agreed, and did not yet know how much would have to be paid, and cracked open and forgiven before that word could be spent. They were married on the Friday, quietly, by special licence, in a chapel that smelled of beeswax and old stone, with Mrs. Hob weeping into a handkerchief she had brought for exactly that purpose, and no other guests but the necessary witnesses. Marian wore her good grey wool, mended at the cuff where no one but she would ever look closely enough to see it, and thought, standing at the rail, that she had negotiated her way into more security in 4 days than 7 years of careful invisibility had ever earned her, and felt, beneath the relief, a thread of something she did not yet have a name for, and was not, in any case, obliged to examine before Sunday. Mrs. Hob found her that same evening polishing the brass stair rail herself, out of habit more than duty, and set down her candle with the particular thump of a woman about to say something she had been saving. "You have married a good man wearing a bad temper for armour," she said. "I noticed the temper," Marian said. "I am still deciding about the man underneath it." "Decide quickly," said Mrs. Hob. "Sunday is not a patient sort of day." She wiped her hands on her apron, though they were perfectly dry, a habit Marian would come to recognise as the surest sign that Mrs. Hob had said exactly as much truth as she intended to, and not one word more, and went off down the passage muttering about candles and duchesses, who polished their own stair rails, which Marian took, correctly, as approval. Julian Vale called at Rothmere Hall on the Saturday, with a bottle of wine he called a wedding gift, and a smile that never reached past his mouth. He found Marian in the small parlour, with the estate ledgers open across her knee, an image that seemed to please and disturb him in equal measure. A duchess, with ink on her fingers. How refreshingly economical. "I was a copyist before I was a duchess," she said. "The habits do not vanish with the title. No," he agreed, "they seldom do." He sat without being asked, which she noted, and turned his glass slowly by its stem, which she also noted, filing both away the way her father had taught her to file every small discourtesy, because discourtesy, unlike affection, always told the truth about a man eventually. "You will find the accounts somewhat disordered," he said. 3 bad harvests, a brother's debts, a house that eats money the way other houses eat coal. I manage what I can." "I imagine you manage a great deal," she said, and watched his hand still on the stem of the glass just for a moment before it resumed its slow turning. "You imagine correctly," Julian said, and smiled at her the way a man smiles at a clock he intends to be rid of before it strikes. "I hope, for your sake, Miss Fenwick, forgive me, your Grace, that you are as good with figures as you are with terms. I am told you drove a very hard bargain." "I drove a fair one," she said. "There is a difference, though I notice not everyone troubles to learn it." He rose then, unoffended or pretending to be, and paused at the door with the particular gentleness of a man laying down a threat the way one lays down a napkin. "Sunday will settle a great many things. I find I am almost looking forward to it." He left the wine untouched on the table, and Marian did not drink it either, though she could not, that evening, have told anyone precisely why. She found the first thread of the trouble, not from suspicion, but from habit, the same evening, turning ledger pages by the last of the daylight, while the house settled around her into its unfamiliar new shape. A column of payments to a name she did not recognise, quarterly, unexplained, drawn against the Duke's private account rather than the estate's. Going back 3 years to within a month of a date Mrs. Hobb had once mentioned, and then swallowed as though she had said too much. The date, Marian would learn far later, that Edmund Averley had died. She copied the entries into her own small book out of nothing more than the copyist's old reflex to keep a fair record of anything that crossed her hand, and thought no more of it that night, though she would think of little else within the week. The Duke found her still at the desk near midnight, and stood a moment in the doorway before he spoke, as though deciding whether the room was his to enter uninvited, which, she thought, watching him hesitate, was itself a kind of answer to a question she had not asked aloud. "You keep late hours for a woman married 4 days," he said. "I keep the hours the figures keep," she said. "They do not observe a wedding as a holiday." He came and stood by the desk, not close, and looked down at the columns she had been working, and for a moment she thought he might explain the payments himself, and spare them both what was coming. He did not. Instead, he said, "You have made yourself useful faster than I expected." And there was something almost like gratitude under the dryness of it, and she said, "It was in the terms," and he said, "So it was." And neither of them moved for a moment longer than the sentence required, until a log shifted in the grate and broke whatever had been building in the quiet, and he wished her good night and went, and she sat a long while after he had gone, turning her pen between 2 fingers, aware that she had noticed something about the particular stillness of his hands when he had looked at those payments, and had not yet decided what it meant. The days narrowed toward Sunday, the way a river narrows toward a weir, and Marian felt the current of it in small things. Mrs. Hobb counting the good linen twice, the Duke's solicitor's clerk riding out from town twice in one afternoon, Julian Vale's visits growing more frequent and more courteous, which she had already learned to read as the opposite of comfort. On the Wednesday, 3 days from the deadline that had made her a duchess, she and Gerard fell into the habit that would, though she did not know it yet, teach her more of him than 100 conversations, working the estate accounts side by side at the long table in the library, he with the correspondence and the rent rolls, she with the ledgers proper, passing figures between them the way other married people might have passed nothing more than the salt. "Your hand is faster than my steward's," he said, watching her total a column twice as quickly as he could read it once. My steward, she thought, was not the right word for a man who signed himself land agent and drew a salary 3 times a housekeeper's, but she let it pass, and said only, "Your steward has had less practice starving for it." He looked up at that, sharp, and she thought she had gone too far, until he said, quietly, "My father starved no one on purpose," and she said, "I did not say he did," and there was a silence that was not quite comfortable and not quite hostile. The particular silence of 2 people discovering they might, eventually, be able to disagree without either of them leaving the room. He told her, that evening, in pieces, the way men tell the things that cost them most, that his brother Edmund had died 3 years before, in a curricle race he should never have run, chasing a debt he could not otherwise pay, and that the old Duke had written the marriage clause into his will not from cruelty, but from the terror of watching one son already gone to grief and gaming both, determined the other would not be permitted to disappear the same way, into a house with no wife in it, and no reason to come home. "I have spent 3 years making certain no one else pays for what Edmund owed," he said, and stopped there, decidedly, the way a man stops at the edge of a cliff he has walked too close to before. There is more, she thought, watching his hands, which had gone very still on the table, the way a man's hands go still when he is holding something up by main force. She did not ask. She had learned from her own father's silences that some doors are better left to open themselves. She learned instead, 2 days later, from an unlikelier source. Mrs. Hobb came upon her in the linen room, folding sheets that did not need folding, which the housekeeper correctly read as a woman, avoiding her own thoughts by giving her hands something honest to do. "There is a lady at the Dower House," Mrs. Hobb said, without preface, "because you will hear it from someone with less kindness in them, if you do not hear it from me first, and I would rather you heard it plain." "Say it plain, then," she said. "His Grace pays the Dower House's keep himself, out of his own pocket, quarterly, and has done for 3 years," Mrs. Hobb said, "and there is talk in the village, ugly talk, that she is his, that he keeps her there for reasons a married man ought not to have." "Do you believe that talk?" Marian asked, and Mrs. Hobb's hands went to her apron, wiping at nothing. "I have scrubbed that man's collars since he was in short coats," she said. "I would sooner believe the moon keeps a mistress." "Then who is she?" Marian asked, and Mrs. Hobb, for the first time since Marian had known her, looked uncertain of her own tongue. "That is not mine to tell," and went out of the room quickly, leaving Marian standing among the folded sheets, with the quarterly payments from the ledger rising up in her memory like a figure she had added wrong, and only just noticed. She did not go to the Dower House that night, though she wanted to, because the copyist in her knew that a figure added wrong deserved checking twice before it was corrected aloud, and because some part of her, newer and less practised, did not want to learn the answer from anyone but him. Julian Vale came upon her instead, the following afternoon, in the estate office where she had gone, ostensibly, to return a set of keys, and in truth to sit a while among the ledgers where her thinking went quietest. He was going through the quarter's receipts with Mr. Pettifer, the under-clerk, a thin, anxious young man who kept his eyes on the desk the way a dog keeps its eyes on a raised hand. "Your Grace," Julian said, "I was just remarking to Pettifer here how fortunate the house is to have gained a wife with such an appetite for figures. Some houses have all the luck. Some houses make their own. Some houses make their own," she said, and set the keys on the desk, and in doing so let her eye fall, only for a heartbeat, on the page Pettifer had opened before him, a column in a hand she did not recognise, sitting beside entries she did. The ink of the newer lines a fraction too black, too fresh, against the older page around it. It was nothing she could have sworn to in a court of law. It was everything a copyist's eye had spent a lifetime learning to see. Pettifer's hand, she noticed, had gone quite still over his pen, the way a man's hand goes still when he is being watched, doing something he did not choose to do. She said nothing. She thanked Julian for his kindness, and left, and did not breathe out properly until she was 3 rooms away, because she had learned, from her father's ruin, that the worst thing a person could do with a half-formed suspicion was announce it before it had learned to stand on its own feet. That night she opened the tin box she had carried through 7 years and 4 households, and took out the torn corner of the note that had sent her father to his death in a debtor's cell, and held it to the candle the way she had held it 100 times before, searching, uselessly, for a signature that had never been whole enough to prove anything. She had long since stopped hoping it would ever mean more than grief kept in a box. She put it away again, and did not yet know how soon she would take it out for the last time. Sunday's shadow lengthened over the house, and with it came the midpoint blow, delivered, as such blows so often are, by a man who never once raised his voice to strike it. Julian Vale called at Rothmere Hall on the Friday evening, 2 days before the reckoning the will demanded, and asked with every appearance of reluctant duty for a private word with the new Duchess. Marian received him in the small parlour, the fire low, and did not offer him wine this time, which he noticed, and did not remark upon. "I have come to do you a kindness you will not thank me for," he said. And she said, "Then you had best begin, since gratitude was never the object." He set a folded paper on the table between them, unopened, the way a man sets down a card he means to let speak for itself. "It concerns the Dower House. I imagine Mrs. Hobb has already frightened you with half of it. I would rather you had the whole. There is no whole that changes my regard for my husband," Marian said, though she had not, until she said it, been entirely certain it was true. Julian's smile did not move, but something behind it did, the way water shifts under ice without breaking it. "The lady at the Dower House is Lady Averley, Edmund's widow. Your husband installed her there within the month of his brother's death, and has visited her, alone, without a chaperone, at hours no honest arrangement requires, ever since. I do not ask you to believe me. I ask only that you ask him where he was on any Thursday evening this 12th, and watch his face while he answers." He rose, satisfied with the shape he had left in the room, and paused at the door as he had paused once before. "I tell you this, your Grace, not from malice, but because I would not have you learn on Sunday, before witnesses, what you might have learned tonight in comfort." And with that he was gone, and Marian sat a long while with the unopened paper before her, understanding, with the particular cold clarity of a woman who has been handed a weapon and told it is a gift, that the crueler part of what he had said was not a lie at all, and that the truth, offered without its other half, could wound as precisely as any forgery. She asked the Duke that same night, in the library, with the ledgers still open between them from the afternoon's work, and watched his hands go still exactly as they had gone still once before, over that same quarterly column, weeks ago, when she had not yet known what she was watching. "Where were you last Thursday evening?" she asked, plainly, because she had decided, walking to the library, that there was no way through a marriage built on terms except straight through the middle of it, in the light. He did not ask why she asked. That, more than anything, told her he had been waiting for the question. "At the Dower House, with my brother's widow. And every Thursday for 3 years," she said, not a question, and he said, "Every Thursday, and some Sundays besides. And I would tell you why, if I believed telling you would not undo the only kindness I have left it in my power to give her." "Then let it undo it," Marian said, "because I have married a man on terms I wrote myself. And one of those terms was never to be lied to by omission, and this is omission, however gently you have dressed it." Something in his face closed then, not in anger, but in the old tired way of a man returning to a room he has spent 3 years trying to keep locked, and he said, very low, "You do not know what you are asking me to spend." And she said, "I know exactly what I am asking, because I have spent 3 years learning to add what people will not tell me, and I have added this wrong for a week. And I would rather be corrected than left in the dark to imagine worse." He looked at her a long moment, and for the first time since the study door, she saw something in his face that was not composure, and was not its absence either, but the space between the two, where a man decides at last whether to be known. He told her then, standing by the cold hearth with his back half turned, the way men tell the things that cost them most. Edmund had not died in a curricle race at all, though the county believed it, because Gerard had let them believe it. Edmund had died by his own hand in the Dower House 3 years before, having lost at cards a sum that would have ruined not only himself, but the tenants whose rents he had gambled without their knowledge, and Gerard had spent every quarter since paying off the debts his brother left, quietly, from his own pocket, and keeping Edmund's widow, Sophie, sheltered and unquestioned at the Dower House, because she had known nothing of any of it, had loved a man who lied to her every day of their short marriage, and did not deserve to carry his shame into a world that would have made her wear it publicly. I did not tell you because I did not want you married to my brother's disgrace, as well as my own arithmetic, he said. I have spent 3 years deciding alone what everyone around me is strong enough to bear, and I see now that it is a poor kind of love, to decide it without asking. It is not love at all, Marian said, gently, because she saw what the confession had cost him, and did not want to spend more of it than the truth required. It is only grief, wearing love's coat because it fits nowhere else. He looked at her as though she had handed him back something he had lost track of owning, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, and the fire, low as it was, seemed to Marian the only honest thing in the room. She did not tell him, that night, of the black ink on Pettifer's page, or the torn corner in her tin box, because some proofs are better carried alone a little longer, until they are heavy enough to set down all at once, and because she had begun, without quite deciding to want to hand him something whole rather than half. Julian Vale, learning the following morning that his gift had been unwrapped and forgiven rather than left to fester, did what men of his kind do when a soft blow fails to land. He came again, on the Saturday, the day before Sunday's reckoning, and this time he did not trouble himself with gentleness. He found Marian alone in the estate office, and set upon the desk between them a folded bank draft, generous, unsigned, and a single sentence of explanation. "Leave him before Sunday," he said, quietly, as if suggesting a change of weather, "and this is yours, together with passage anywhere you like, and no questions asked of either of us again. Stay, and you will find yourself married to a man the trustee is very likely to declare unfit to hold his own estate, on grounds I have spent 3 years preparing, and a duchess is a poor thing to be married to a pauper. I would advise you to take the kinder road while it is offered." Marian looked at the draft a long moment, long enough that Julian's mouth curved, certain of his answer, and then she pushed it back across the desk with one finger, the way one returns a coin found short. "I did not marry him for the fortune," she said, "so I find I have very little use for yours. And if Sunday goes as you promise, and he is ruined, I will still be his wife on the Monday morning, penniless and glad of it, which I imagine is a great deal more than you will be able to say for yourself." Julian's smile did not falter, but his hand, reaching to reclaim the draft, was not quite as steady as it had been, and Marian filed that too, carefully, the way her father had taught her, because a hand that shakes over money is a hand with more to lose than it will admit. The darkest hour came, as it so often does, dressed as an ordinary morning. On the Sunday itself, before the trustee's carriage had even turned into the drive, Julian arrived early with Mr. Aldous Gray at his side, and a leather case of papers under his arm, and informed Gerard, in the hearing of the assembled household, that the estate's own books would show, on examination, 3 years of payments made from the private account to an unnamed woman at the Dower House. Payments the trustee would be bound, under the terms of the late Duke's will, to weigh against his heir's fitness to hold the property at all, marriage clause satisfied or not. He said it kindly, regretfully, the way a man announces a death he has not caused, and Marian, watching him say it, understood at last what Mrs. Hobbs' silence and her own uneasy ledgers had been circling for a fortnight, that Julian did not merely intend to inherit by default. He intended to see Gerard disgraced as well as dispossessed, so that no court of good opinion would ever question the justice of the loss. Gerard stood very still through all of it. The stillness Marian had learned by now was not the absence of feeling but its most disciplined form, and said only, "We will let the trustee see whatever is true," and asked for an hour before the reading, and went out to the stables alone, and Marian understood that he had gone to say goodbye, in his own fashion, to a fortune he had already half decided to lose with dignity rather than fight for with lies. She did not follow him. She went instead to the tin box in her own room, and took out the torn corner of her father's ruin, and sat a long while turning it in the light, thinking of Pettifer's too black ink, and of a column of payments she had copied into her own book without knowing, yet what she had copied it for, and felt, for the first time in 11 years, that the two halves of her life, the daughter who had lost everything to a forged hand, and the Duchess who had married a man half ruined by his own silence, had finally, quietly, begun to add toward the same sum. She found Pettifer in the estate office an hour later, alone, sorting papers with the particular haste of a man trying to look occupied rather than afraid, and she did not accuse him of anything, because accusation, she had learned, closes a mouth faster than it opens one. She only set her own small copybook on the desk beside his ledger, open to the page where she had transcribed, weeks before, the quarterly payments in a hand that was not the estate's usual hand, and said very quietly, "I am not asking you to answer for Mr. Vale's sins, Miss Pettifer. I am asking whether you would rather answer for your own, on your own terms, before a trustee decides them for you this afternoon." Pettifer's pen went still, the way it had gone still once before under Julian's eye, and this time there was no one else in the room to watch him decide. "I have a mother in the village," he said, at last, very low. "He told me he would see her turned out of her cottage if I did not enter the figures as he gave them to me. I did not forge anything with my own hand, Your Grace. I only wrote what I was told, and told myself that was different. It is different," Marian said, "and it is also not enough, not today. Will you tell the trustee what you have just told me?" Pettifer's hands, when he finally looked up, were shaking in a way his pen had not, and he said, "If you will stand near me when I do," and she said, "I will stand exactly where you need me," and thought, not for the first time that week. That courage was very often simply fear that had finally found a witness worth having. The trustees' party assembled that afternoon in the long gallery, where the light came down through tall windows onto floors that had seen 3 generations of Averleys settle their business, and Marian counted the witnesses as she entered on her husband's arm the way she had once counted figures. Mr. Aldous Gray at the head of the table with the will and the estate books before him, Julian composed and faintly smiling in his chair, Pettifer white faced by the door, Mrs. Hobb wringing her apron in the doorway though she had not been asked to attend, and, unexpectedly, Lady Cressida Thorne, who had come, she said, only to see how the county's most interesting marriage had turned out, though her eyes, when they found Julian, held something colder and more curious than idle gossip usually wears. Mr. Gray opened the proceedings with the necessary formalities, the marriage confirmed, the licence examined and found sound, the clause of the will thereby satisfied on its narrowest reading, and then turned, gravely, to the second matter before them, which was the state of the estate's accounts, and whether they showed a man fit to hold what he had married in time to keep. Julian rose first, as he had clearly planned to, and laid his leather case upon the table with the calm of a man who has rehearsed his own righteousness. Here are 3 years of payments from His Grace's private purse to an unexplained party at the Dower House, unrecorded in any household reckoning, concealed from the estate's own steward until discovered by careful audit. I bring this forward with the greatest reluctance, Mr. Gray, but a trustee cannot in conscience overlook it. There was a murmur along the table, and Gerard's hand, beside Marian's on the arm of her chair, tightened once and then deliberately loosened, as though he had decided, in that instant, not to spend his composure on Julian's satisfaction. "Before this house judges my husband on those payments," Marian said, rising, "I should like the trustee to see what they were actually spent to protect, and why the man who now offers them as evidence of disgrace is not, perhaps, the most disinterested witness in this room." She laid before Mr. Gray, first, her own copybook, opened to the page where the payments sat beside her careful transcription of the dates, 3 years running, each one a fortnight after quarter day and never once late, which she said aloud was not the pattern of a man's vice, but the pattern of a debt honoured on a schedule, the schedule of a man determined no one else should ever be made to wait for what he owed. Then she called, gently, for Pettifer, who came forward with his hands clasped so tightly the knuckles had gone white, and told the room, in a voice that broke twice and steadied both times, that he had entered false figures into the estate ledgers at Mr. Vale's direction over 18 months to make the estate appear more encumbered than it was, and that he had been threatened, when he hesitated, with the loss of his mother's cottage. Julian's composure, for the first time since Marian had known him, developed a hairline crack, visible only in the sudden stillness of his hands, which had, until that moment, never once stopped their slow, unhurried motion. "That is a frightened boy's fancy," he said too quickly, and Mr. Gray said, mildly, "Then you will have no objection to the estate's books being examined against Miss Fenwick's copy, which was made, I understand, before any of this was in question." And Julian said nothing at all, which told the room a great deal more than any answer could have. It was then that Marian set the last thing upon the table, the torn corner of a promissory note 11 years old, brittle at its folds, and beside it the leather case Julian had brought himself, opened now to a page of his own hand, the same hand unmistakably, in the loops of the letter G, and the particular downward slash he gave every capital V. A hand she had spent a childhood learning to fear without ever once seeing its owner's face. "I did not come to this house to settle my own father's account," she said, and her voice, to her own surprise, did not shake at all. "But I find I have. My father, Thomas Fenwick, died in a debtor's gaol 11 years ago over a note he swore he never signed. I have carried the only piece of it that survived him since I was 14 years old, waiting for the other half to surface, though I had long since stopped believing it would. It has surfaced today, Mr. Gray, in your hands, in the same hand that falsified this house's accounts, because a man who forges once and profits by it rarely stops at once." She turned the torn corner over and set it against the edge of the page Julian had brought to damn her husband, and the tear matched, fibre for fibre, the way 2 halves of a thing broken long ago will always know each other when they are finally brought back together. Mr. Gray held both pieces to the window light for a long, silent moment, and then set them down, and looked at Julian Vale with the particular weariness of a man who has just been asked to judge a case he already sorrowfully understands. "Mr. Vale, "Is there anything you wish to say?" And Julian, for the first time in the whole of the proceedings, did not smile. He said, at last, very quietly, that his mother had been an Averley by birth, and had married beneath what she believed was her due, and that he had grown up watching his cousins inherit rooms he was only ever permitted to dust, that he had forged one note, 20 years before, in a fit of arithmetic he had told himself was justice, and that it had bought him a place at Rothmere he had spent every year since terrified of losing, and that terror, he said, his voice thinning at last into something almost human, had made him do worse and worse things to keep what one small crime had first given him. It was not love of money. It was only ever the fear of being the spare again. The room was very still. Somewhere outside, ordinary and unconcerned, a bird went on singing, and Marian thought, watching Julian's face come apart at last into something that looked less like villainy and more like grief, poorly worn, that pity was a heavier thing to carry than anger had ever been, and heavier still to hand to a man who had tried to ruin you. Mr. Grey pronounced, in the end, that Julian Vale would forfeit any claim under the will, that the estate would press no charge that named him publicly, for the sake of the innocent bearing his name, and for the sake of a boy who had already suffered enough for another man's fear, and that he would remove to the continent within the month on a small allowance sufficient to keep him from want and no more, on the express condition that Pettifer's mother keep her cottage undisturbed for the whole of her natural life. "It is not mercy he has earned," Gerard said, when asked whether he consented to so light a sentence, "but it is the mercy that costs this house the least, and protects the people he frightened the most. And I find, examining my own conscience, that I would rather be the kind of man who chooses that arithmetic than the kind who chooses the other." Lady Cressida Thorne, who had come, she said, only to watch, found Marian afterward on the terrace, and stood a moment before speaking, touching her earring in the particular way Marian had already learned meant a lie was forming, and then visibly let her hand fall still. "I came today hoping to see you both ruined," she said plainly, "because I had wanted this house for myself once, and hated you for wanting it less and getting it anyway. I find I cannot manage the hatred after watching that boy's hands shake." "You are welcome to want less of me, and more of your own good sense," Marian said, not unkindly. And Cressida almost laughed, and said, "I begin to think that is the only advice worth taking this year," and left, some weeks later, for her aunt's house in Bath, where she would, in time, though neither of them knew it yet, make a match far kinder than the one she had once schemed for. The house exhaled that evening the way a house exhales after a long fever breaks, and Marian found Gerard alone in the library, where the ledgers still lay open from the day before the world had rearranged itself around them both. "You did not have to bring your father's note into that room," he said. "You could have let mine stand or fall on its own accounts." "I did not do it for your accounts," she said. "I did it because I have spent 11 years believing a debt like that could never be settled, and I found this morning that I did not want to go on believing it a moment longer than I had to." He came and stood close, closer than the terms she had written aloud for, though she found she did not want to consult them. "I told you once I would decide alone what people were strong enough to bear," he said. "I find I was wrong about that in every direction I ever tried it. I would like to stop deciding alone, if you will have me as a partner in it rather than a debt discharged." "That was never in the terms," she said, though her voice had gone unsteady at last, after a whole day of steadiness. "Write new ones," he said. "I will sign whatever you ask, and mean every word of it this time for reasons that have nothing to do with Sunday." She looked at him a long moment, the man who had married her on a deadline and unmade himself, slowly, into someone she had not contracted for at all, and said, "Marry me, because you wish it then. It is the only reason I will take twice." "I already have," he said. I find I would like to say it properly, without a clerk in the room, and he took her hand, turning his signet ring once around his finger the way he did when a thing mattered too much for speech, to keep pace with it, and said, "I love you, Marian Averley, on no terms whatsoever," and watched her laugh, unguarded, for what he told her afterward was the first time he had heard it without a ledger. Somewhere nearby to explain it. They were married again, properly this time, in the eyes of no Will and no Sunday, the following autumn, in the same small chapel, with Mrs. Hobb weeping into the same handkerchief and declaring, loudly to anyone who would listen, that she had known it from the first week, though she had, in fact, said nothing of the kind to Marian at the time, which Marian did not correct her on, because some kindnesses are best let stand exactly as remembered. Sophie came from the dower house for the first time in 3 years to stand as witness, thin and quiet, and at last unafraid, and told Marian privately that she had grieved a man who lied to her every day of their marriage, and had spent 3 years grateful to another man who never once had, and that she thought, watching the two of them at the rail, that grief and gladness could, after all, share a roof without either one crowding out the other. Pettifer's mother kept her cottage, and sent, every quarter for the rest of her days, a basket of plums to the Hall in gratitude, which Mrs. Hobb accepted each time with exactly the same complaint about the state of the lane, and exactly the same care in setting them by the window to ripen. Julian Vale wrote once, from Calais, a single close-written page that said nothing of apology and everything of weather and cheap lodgings, and Gerard read it without visible feeling, and set it in a drawer rather than the fire, which Marian understood, without being told, as its own quiet form of mercy. Cressida Thorne married, the following spring, a widowed baronet with 3 unruly daughters and a genuine fondness for her wit, and wrote to Marian once a year thereafter, always beginning her letters, dryly, "I still cannot decide whether I like you." A year turned, near enough, and Marian found herself again in the corridor outside the study, a letter in her hand she had every right to be holding this time, and heard Gerard's voice through the half-open door, not raised, telling their steward, a good, plain man promoted from among the tenants, who owed his post to no one's forgery, that the harvest accounts could wait until she had seen them first, because her eye caught what is missed, and he had stopped, some months back, minding the difference. She did not linger at the door to listen this time. She went in, freely, the way a woman goes into a room she is certain is hers. And he looked up and smiled, the smile she had once had to learn to recognise, and now knew the way she knew her own hand, and said, "I was just telling him a ledger balances or it does not. There is no third answer." "I have heard you say that before," she said, setting the letter down between them. "And what do you find now?" "I find," he said, taking her hand across the desk, "that mine does, and outside, ordinary and unbothered as it had been the very first afternoon, a thrush went on singing, as though it had been waiting, all that year, for someone to finally have the leisure to notice. If this story warmed you, if you found yourself hoping, somewhere around Sunday, that a torn scrap of paper kept 11 years might finally mean something, then come sit a while longer by this fire with me. There is a chair kept for you here, a kettle always near the boil, and no ledger anywhere in sight, unless you have brought one yourself. Tell me, if you would, which moment held you fastest, the wife bought on terms, the brother's silent debt, or the torn corner finding its other half at last. I do love to hear which hinge a story turns on for you, and if you have not yet done it, stay close by subscribing, so there is always a place kept warm for you the next time I have a tale worth telling. Until then, sleep well, and be gentle with the ones who have been quietly paying down debts of the heart no one ever asked them to carry.